Hi, I'm Ken Carrier with DTN. I'm joined here today with Kevin Christie from Lightsource BP. We're here to talk about his operational experience mitigating the risk from significant hail events for his renewable power company. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Before we go into a deep dive on the details of your current hailstone program, I was hoping that maybe you could kind of share a real high level overview of Lightsource BP, who they are, what type of operational footprint they have, and maybe a little bit about your role in the organization.
Sure thing. So Lightsource BP is a 50-50 joint venture between the Lightsource employee shareholders and BP. Lightsource was an independent solar developer based in the UK. I co-founded a US business for Lightsource back in late 2017 or 2016, early 2017. And then at the end of 2017, BP invested in us 43% at the time, I believe. They stepped it up to 50. And we are now the exclusive solar development platform for BP globally. We've developed over 8 gigawatts of projects, and we're in 20 different countries. We have about 1.6, 1.7 gigawatts operational in the US now, with a similar amount in construction. Quite a large pipeline globally of projects on the way.
Again, before we get into kind of the details of what you're currently doing in the current operational environment with your hailstone program, I think it's maybe beneficial and instructional for me and maybe some of the viewers here to talk a little bit about what the cost of doing business looked like before you had the hailstone program, from an operational safety, financial standpoint.
Yeah, I think probably the prevailing attitude around hail risk, I'd say prior to 2020, was that's what insurance is for. The modules are hail tested up to a certain size, and we have insurance if the hailstones get bigger than that. However, there were, especially in West Texas, several claims events, culminating in one in 2019 that was an $80 million loss. And that, in conjunction with other natural catastrophe losses that the insurance industry had been experiencing in solar, especially flood, wildfire, and high wind, that we started to see in 2020 the beginning of what we call this current hard market, where we have, for a number of different natural catastrophe categories, separate deductibles and separate coverage limits. So the reality for our largest project in Texas is that our deductible specifically for hail went to $5 million, with, I want to say, about a $50 million coverage limit. And in subsequent renewals, the deductibles have gone up and the coverage limits have gone down and rates have gone up. It's just very characteristic of a classically hard insurance market, where rates go up and underwriting terms get more strict, and
right.
They're just trying to find the right blend of price and risk retention, that works for them and this industry. So in the meantime, owners have a lot of loss exposure that they weren't looking down the barrel of before.
Yeah.
And so that means that with respect to hail risk, for those of us who have large, ground-mounted projects in the continental U.S., especially east of the Rockies, we need to make sure that we have an active hail defense.
Yeah, insurance companies are really good about minimizing their risk, which means that as an operator, you've got to figure out how to mitigate your risk as well from an operational standpoint.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about your hailstone program. I mean, how did you come about implementing this? What were some of the key learnings that you had in putting this in place to help your company?
Sure. Well, all of our utility scale projects in the U.S., and this is very classically the case for ground-mounted utility scale projects in the United States, is they employ single axis trackers. And what this means is that all of the rows of the modules are aligned on a north-south basis. And very simply, in the morning, the modules are tilted over to the east to catch the morning sun. And then they follow the trajectory of the sun across the sky, tilting to the west at the end of the day. And then, you have whatever your specified nighttime stow angle is. So
Yeah.
it was very typical prior to, of these active hail stow events is they would stow them at 0 degree in order to collect as much dew on them as they could, so that when they rolled them over, the dew would take off dust at night, or sometimes they're at a relatively low tilt, for wind deflection purposes. One of the things that we did is, now that you can control the angle of the tilt dynamically, we decided, first thing we did is, well, every night we'll put it into hail stow, so that if we miss, the fact that there's hail risk at night, it's okay, because we're
Yeah.
always in, hail mitigation mode.
There's
Where
no
we have to
downside.
get more,
You're not generating power, so there's no downside at night.
we're not generating power. The trackers don't move at night. You just pick a place to stick them and you put them there. Now, during the day, when storms arrive during the day, and very typically they arrive in the afternoon, and sometimes they can linger into the morning. But if we're talking about storms that arrive in the afternoon, we'll want to make sure that we're looking at the hourly forecasts, looking for predictions of thunderstorms, especially heavy thunderstorms, and we'll be reading the National Weather Service's narrative, describing what areas are exposed to higher levels of risk. We also look at the National Weather Service's convective outlooks. They publish these convective outlooks on a day 1, day 2, and day 3 basis, where they'll basically create a risk map across the United States of hail risk. And I have example from this is a tool that we use that actually pulls in data that's provided by DTN on a in a GIS basis. So sharing my screen now. Here, what we're looking at, rendered in our own tool, is the National Weather Service's convective outlook risk maps for hail, as delivered to us by DTN. And all of these stars on here are locations of various projects. And so we're looking at where our projects lie within these risk maps. And if we have projects such as this one here, which is relatively close to one of the yellow bands, which is a 15% risk of large hail, then we'll watch those a little more closely. These guys over here, very low risk of hail. We may take 1 or 2 looks at them, but generally speaking, it's not until the risk gets into the yellow areas where we start seeing actual large, potentially damaging hail. And these black hatched areas here, that's where the risk of the larger stones would be. So if we have a project that is in or near one of these hatched areas, or if it is a red zone or a purple zone, when they get into like higher and higher levels of risk, then we will be very focused in looking at the hourlies, as we call them, all throughout the day, to try to see when the heavy thunderstorms are due to arrive. And then very typically what we'll do is we'll form a hail stow order with a start time that we project about an hour before the arrival of the hour in which we're seeing storms. So if we're seeing storms in the 2 o'clock hour, typically we'll stow at the beginning of the 1 o'clock hour.
Gotcha.
Just to make sure to give ourselves some room there. And then we'll continue to monitor the hourlies, because sometimes the storms advance up. More commonly, they sort of slow down and arrive later, but sometimes they do speed up and arrive earlier. And so when we have projects that are at an elevated level of risk, we're looking at these hourly forecasts on a regular basis, looking for forecasts of heavy thunderstorm.
Fantastic. So you're kind of using these storm prediction center polygons of risk to identify the areas of interest where you're going to have significant probability of an event occurring that you want to monitor a little bit more closely. And then you go into an active monitoring situation for those assets, which can then lead to the looking at the hourly forecast data for thunderstorm events, and then potentially issuing a manual hail stow trigger. Is that kind of the order of procedure? Okay.
That's right. Yeah, and we have a live Teams chat that the weather team all participates in. These are folks who have other jobs, in addition to monitoring the weather. We don't have a full-time weather monitoring staff, but we have folks who that is, part of their role is to
Yeah.
be on this pool of people who are informed about how to read these maps and know how to gauge the level of risk. And then we very typically have a group conversation, come to an agreement about whether or not we should go into stow. And then one of us will draft the stow order, send it to the operations center, and then follow up with a phone call to make sure that they've received it, and then check in again about the time that the dispatch was supposed to happen to make sure that the operations center actually processed the dispatch. And then we very typically will be notified when the end of the hail stow period has hit, and the plant will return to normal operations, as we call it. Which if it's nighttime, nothing changes effectively, right? Because we're already in hail stow at night, as I mentioned. But if it's during the day, then we'll go, we're expecting the sun to come back out. We'll go back into normal operations at that point.
What are some of the other tools that you're using? For example, like radar generated tools or things like that kind of help as well.
So our tool actually pulls in data from DTN's backend, which includes the ability to visualize hail swaths. So I'm not sure how frequently DTN updates this data, but I would suspect it's within an hour to 4 hours.
It's actually updated more like every minute to 5 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I certainly see that in the storm corridors, which I guess I'll show in a moment. But these hail swaths are very helpful, not just because they show where the hail has fallen, but they include the size estimates based upon the radar record, right? So we can, and they're heat mapped, so we can see where the more severe hail is, and hopefully see that none of our sites are directly under, something like a 2.5-inch hail drop. But this is so, we've got the plant into stow, and we just, are kind of watching the drama unfold. Then we use DTN's other tools such as Storm Corridor, and we're seeing a few of them here, right? So these different color wedges illustrate different paths of storms and different types of risks. So here in the white wedges typically mean heavy rain. The red wedges indicate possible tornado. The orange wedges indicate dangerous thunderstorms, and the ones that we're most focused on are the yellow wedges, which indicate severe hail. And so if we see yellow wedges that are pointed in the direction of one of our projects, then we know that hail could be inbound for one of our sites, whereas all we would have from other services would be like rain radar forecasts.
Gotcha.
But that doesn't tell you whether it's going to be hail. That's a particular, tool that we get from DTN that allows us to visualize impending hail risk.
But it looks like that one, it's got a 100% probability of 1.25 inch size hail, which is, I guess, is that kind of approaching the threshold of the size that you folks would consider to be potentially damaging for the solar panels, or?
You're getting there. This is typically close to the max tested limit. I would think that modules could well get damaged at 1.5 to 1.75 if they were flat and the hail is coming straight down.
Yeah.
That's beyond that's how they're tested, by the way, is they shoot freezer ice balls with no air content directly at the modules. So a 1.25 inch freezer ice ball is probably going to have more mass than an equivalent 1.25 inch hailstone, because hailstones have a lot of air content in them, which is why they're white as opposed to clear, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I say we could probably withstand 1.5 to 1.75, because it's probably the equivalent of a freezer ice ball at 1.25 inch.
One of the questions that operators are probably apt to have is, how do you manage false alarms, and how do you manage false positives, and do you have any key performance indicators that you're using to kind of continually tune the program, and if so, what's the performance look like so far?
Yeah, well, we have one prevailing goal for the program, and that is, as we call it, zero false negatives. So that means that we are never not in stow when a potentially damaging hailstorm arrives at the site. and we're willing to tolerate, as many false positives as, we reasonably will have to endure, because it's impossible to accurately predict, whether or not hail is going to hit a particular given area. The risk areas, as we showed here, are quite large.
Yeah.
And actual hail activity will typically be like fingers of hail swaths through this area. So on a percentage basis, a very small percent of this area would actually be struck by hail. But the risk of it is such that any solar project within that area would want to be going into stow. And so you're just going to have a lot of false positives. What we're trying to minimize is going into stow much earlier than we, would need to, especially if the sun is shining. Don't really want to go into hail stow when the sun is shining. But if it's full cloud cover, we will lose at least 80% of production from a solar plant, and it goes down from there. So if it's fully cloudy outside, you're going to lose very little production by going into hail stow because there's no direct sunlight anyway. It's all sort of ambient, right?
Yeah, so the risk reward formula gets skewed in favor of taking less risk at that point. So
that's right. That's right.
Well, very good. Well, listen, Kevin, I really thank you for walking us through all that. Are there any final thoughts or comments that you might want to share with some of the folks that are listening in the audience today?
Sure. I would put the offer out there as I have in the past, and folks have taken us up on it. Is if any of our friendly competitors are interested in just hearing about how we manage this hail risk in greater detail, we're happy to share that. And the reason is because we don't view this as a competitive advantage. This is just our internal method of risk mitigation. And we all benefit as an industry as risk adoption or risk mitigation methods are increasingly adopted and used, and best practices are developed. So I think we're being really open about this, and hopes that we as an industry will settle on some best practices around how to mitigate this risk for the long term.
Well, that's great industry collaboration and a heck of an offer. So thank you very much for extending that to everybody. Well, look. I want to thank our guest, Kevin Chrissy, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to join us here today. For parting words, I'd just like to say that, this is an example of yet another company who has the same weather threats as lots of other renewable operators and the same business challenges from those threats, but who chose to really employ better data to get better insights so that they could mitigate some of the risks to their organization. So thanks again, Kevin. It was an absolute pleasure.